Even though we don't have any men on the dais, I think there's quite a few in the audience, so which is great. It's also quite unusual for me when we go to workshops which are focused on gender or sessions that are on gender. It's usually just women sitting there, none of the men are there. It's become like gender research is about women, for women, by women, about women. So thanks for being here. And we would have loved to hear some men speaking, but next time. But yeah, first of all, thanks to IFPRI for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts on this topic at this very important event and for the region. This quote kind of summarizes best for me the relationship between women and food systems. Food systems, food makes them both vulnerable and powerful, victimized and empowered at the same time. And looking at a lot of evidence that's been emerging, several speakers yesterday, almost everybody I thought, actually mentioned how women are amongst the most vulnerable to different kinds of crises and how their capacity to cope and thrive during and after these crises is very limited because of the structural barriers that they face. So drawing on some of the recent evidence from the food policy report, but also some brand new sort of evidence and publications that have come out, the status of women in agri-food systems by FAO, to which CGIAR contributed significantly, came out last month. The reducing inequalities by the high-level panel actually came out only last week. All of them talk about these triple crises that the world is facing and how women are most vulnerable. So drawing on some of that, if you look at the SWAPs, as we call it, the status of women in agri-food systems, that actually shows that in South Asia, 71% of women and 47% men work in agri-food systems. Basically, agri-food systems are more important for the livelihoods of women than men. But the women in this sector tend to be very poorly paid, part-time, and mostly in the informal sector. And as Yo said yesterday, we have relatively little evidence on the impacts of conflict on gender equality or women's vulnerability, but relatively a little more on COVID and climate change, the impacts of that on women. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that these crises are not coming to us one after another. We are facing multiple crises at the same time. Climate change is happening. And then you have conflicts on top of that, or you have COVID and conflict and climate change happening. So making the challenge, really complex and wicked to address. And it is creating a chronic stress for the most vulnerable, which includes women. And then what we have seen during COVID is also the increased care work burden on women. That's been quite widely documented, and the increasing gender-based violence, both outside and domestic violence because of all the lockdowns, etc. And this whole unpaid care work is something that we do have to pay attention to. And because it reduces the time available for these women to pursue other economic opportunities, to enhance their incomes or increase their resilience. Just as a glimpse, data from India shows that 76% of the unpaid care work in households is done by women. Men on an average spend an hour and a half on care work, domestic work, while women spend 5 hours. The situation and the numbers are not very different in the other countries in the region. So this is something to think about. And this is what happened as a result of COVID and the other crises. the insecurity, the food insecurity, the gap between men and women increased from 1.7% to 4.3%. And in the first year of COVID, while 22% of women lost their jobs in the off-farm segments, only 2% of men lost their jobs. So that's again something. And women continue to get only 82 cents to a dollar for every dollar that a man earns in this sector. So if we look at some of these, evidence, what's coming out of these crisis settings, and I'll go through this fairly quickly because I think almost every speaker yesterday mentioned a lot of these. Again, some people are more equal than others, some women are more equal than other women. Not all women are not a homogeneous group, some socioeconomic groups across men and women, but across even within women actually were more affected than others, and there have been multifarious impacts of these. I'm not sure if I did wrong, but yeah, okay. Right. And women were already vulnerable, but then these crises have worsened their situation. We talked about increasing gender-based violence, and in the session on value chains yesterday, we heard how the emergency measures to curtail some of these crises, stopping the COVID infection from spreading, several emergency measures were taken that affected the input and output markets, disrupted the food supply chains, cost of inputs went up, labor became scarce, so was machine availability, and as a result, agricultural production and productivity was affected. Reducing incomes and cash available to these women also led to asset depletion. Evidence shows that when incomes go down, the first resort of rural households is to sell assets owned by women, like livestock and small jewelry and household items and so on. And as a result, the food and nutrition security was also negatively affected. We've seen increasing food prices, and we know that the poorest and the most vulnerable people actually spend 2/3 of their income on food. So if the incomes have gone down and the prices have increased, they hardly have anything left to eat, spend on food. I mean, and evidence shows that while the world produces enough food to feed everybody, the entire population, but more than 3.1 billion people do not have access to diets that have essential nutrients. And 60% of these malnourished are women and girls. So it has all these impacts that we are talking about. But one thing that we do need to take cognizance of is women are not just victims. We've seen a number of cases and evidence where women actually showed how they are resilient and how they can be agents of change if given the necessary enabling conditions. And then this again, I mean, there was a famous figure from FAO in 2011 which talked about how if you reduce the gender gap in access to resources, productive resources, how productivity would go up. This is like the newest figures, 10 years from the 2011 one in the new SWAPS report, that the gender gap in farm productivity continues to persist. The difference between productivity, land productivity, on farms managed by men and women, farms of the same size, is still 24%. We didn't manage to make much dent on that one. But if we close this gender gap, we can actually increase the gross domestic product globally by $1 trillion, and we can reduce the food insecurity by 45 million people. And even if half of the small producers benefit from the development interventions which are focused on empowering women, it will raise incomes of another 58 million people. I'd like to think that we can now stop justifying why we need to invest in women's empowerment or gender equality and start thinking about how we do it. There is enough evidence, business case as to why we need to do it. But the point is, how do we do that? If we look at the response measures, COVID and after, a lot of the fiscal measures were mostly gender neutral. And they focused on urban areas and very biased towards the formal sector. Women in agribusinesses in rural areas didn't get an awful lot of support. Social protection definitely helped. The direct cash transfers, safety nets, and the food assistance were immensely helpful. There were a few agricultural support measures, but very little known on how they benefited women in some of these value chains beyond the production. And then very few asset support measures were there. So as we are talking about policy responses, I think the important thing is to make sure we are intentional about this. I mean, much of the current policy and technical guidance in food and nutrition security arena is gender blind. If you look at this, 75% of policy documents in 68 countries recognize women's role and their challenges, but only 19% of those actually have policy goals explicitly related to gender or gender equality. So unless we are intentional, there's no way we are going to tackle any of these unless we have those goals and goals that are measurable. And yesterday, I think there was a lot of discussion around how we need to be looking at anticipatory action and building resilience rather than being reactive. And I think that's really key. And several of these new reports, and we all have been talking about how it's really important to go beyond the manifestations of this gender equality, the gender gaps as we call it. Let's not try and fix them in the short term, but then forget what is actually leading to those gender inequalities, which is the gender norms, social and gender norms, the patriarchy. And this region, as all of us know, is quite notorious for that and hard to move on that front. So, but unless we do something about it, we are not going to make much progress. And this new HLPE report on inequality actually talks about recognition, representation, and redistribution as some of the main principles that we should be working towards. And then quickly talking about a few options. There is going to be a next crisis. We don't like it, we don't want it, but I don't think we have an option. I think it's going to come. So how can we be better prepared for that, especially looking at gender equality? Lot of talk, several people mentioned, especially the value chain session, we talked about market links and processing, value addition, technologies, input provision. How do we make sure these are all reaching women? We are focusing on crops and value chains where women engage in. Vegetables and fruits is one that women engage in. They are also important for nutrition, but they are also perishable. So, how do we protect their businesses and production from these losses? And then yesterday we did talk about provision of seeds and, maintaining livestock and so on quite a bit. Very, very important for women. Access to finance. Women still have limited access to formal financial resources. We have very few women-friendly financial products or risk management products, insurances and so on. We need some products that work for women, collateral-free, because they don't own land. They can't mortgage, land to get those loans. Low-interest loans, which can take care of their income flows and consumption loans, etc. And then we keep talking about digital, innovations. Yes, they have a huge potential, but don't forget that we still have a significant gender gap in this region, gender-digital divide in this region. And we've got to bridge that if we want these digital innovations to be helpful and benefit women. Making, given the labor shortages, making machinery available to women when needed. And a lot of emphasis on early warning systems and climate information, but evidence shows that a lot of it is not usable by women. What information are we conveying? Is it good enough for them to use and make decisions locally? Something to think about. And then we talked about focusing on nutrition, sensitive agricultural value chains, protecting assets of women. Quite a bit of discussion since yesterday on data and evidence, but then we need gender disaggregated data. And it needs to go beyond just men and women. We need to look at other intersectional factors, age, caste, class, ethnicity, location, etc. That is very important for us to make any meaningful policies. We've talked about foresight and anticipatory actions. This is a wicked challenge. These are wicked challenges, as we said, multifarious, multifaceted problems. So you need multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral solutions. No silver bullets, no simple solutions are going to work. And then extension service is important. And then the last point that I want to make is about making women, the actors who can drive some of these transformations. Make women and their groups, collective action, groups of women are supposed to build their resilience quite significantly. How can we engage women to be a core part of the solution? They are leaders, they are innovators, they are farmers, they are value chain actors, they are consumers, they are caretakers. 50% of the population or more. Don't forget them, and let's have that principle in mind. Engage them in policy discussions and policy making. Nothing about us without us. Thank you.